3 days after Dorothy Hale died, the entire town of Grover Falls fell apart. Not because they missed her. Most of them hadn't given her a second thought in years. She was just the old woman on Sycamore Lane, 81 years old, walked with a cane, talked slowly, sometimes got names wrong, sometimes repeated herself. The kind of woman people smile at with a little too much patience. The way you smile at someone you've already decided doesn't matter. The mayor called her poor old Dorothy at least once a month. The police chief called her a sweet lady who gets confused. Her own nephew called her a burden directly to her face at Christmas dinner 2 years ago. She smiled and passed the potatoes. She was also, it turned out, recording all of it. All of it. Every conversation, every deal, every secret, every lie, every moment of cruelty and corruption that passed through or near her house on Sycamore Lane for 4 years, 6 months, and 11 days. And 3 days after she died, quietly, in her sleep, in the same chair she'd been sitting in for 40 years, a scheduled upload hit the internet. 14 hours of footage. Every single person in Grover Falls with something to hide woke up on a Thursday morning and found out that Dorothy Hale had seen them, and that she had made absolutely certain the world would too. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought you weren't paying attention, this one's for you. Stay with me. Quick note before we go further. People watch these stories every day without hitting subscribe, which costs nothing and takes 2 seconds. If you want to be here when the next one drops, you know what to do. Now, let's get into it. Let me tell you about Dorothy Hale, because the world didn't bother to, and it should have. Dorothy had lived in Grover Falls her entire life, born there, raised there, married there to a man named George Hale, a high school history teacher who died of a heart attack at 63 and left her the house on Sycamore Lane, a decent savings account, and a garden she still tended every morning until the arthritis made kneeling impossible. She had no children. She'd wanted them. That was a grief she had carried quietly for decades and never made other people's problem. What she had instead was a town she had watched grow up around her. She remembered when the mayor's office was a hardware store. She remembered when the police chief was a skinny 12-year-old who stole apples from her garden and looked mortified when she caught him and didn't tell his mother. She had been the church secretary for 22 years. She had organized every bake sale, every fundraiser, every community drive that Grover Falls had run since 1987. She knew where the money went. She knew who showed up and who didn't. She knew which smiles were real. Then George died, and Dorothy got older, and Grover Falls the way towns do quietly reclassified her. She went from Dorothy Hale, community pillar, to Dorothy Hale, sweet old lady, to, eventually, Dorothy Hale, poor, confused thing. It happened slowly, a few repeated questions that got whispered about, a moment at the pharmacy where she couldn't remember her PIN, and the girl behind the counter exchanged a look with the customer behind Dorothy that Dorothy absolutely saw and absolutely filed away. A family dinner where her nephew Craig spoke about her in the third person while she was sitting right there discussing her house, her savings, her situation. With the particular confidence of a man who has already decided that the person he's discussing can't quite follow the conversation anymore. Dorothy followed every word. Dorothy had always followed every word. What the town of Grover Falls had done was confuse slow with absent, confuse quiet with unaware, confuse old with finished. They were about to learn the difference. The second person you need to know is Craig Hale, Dorothy's nephew. Her late husband, George's brother's son, 44 years old, managed a car dealership on the edge of town, drove a truck that was 2 sizes too large for any practical purpose, and had been angling for Dorothy's house on Sycamore Lane for going on 6 years. Craig wasn't evil in a dramatic way. He was evil in the ordinary way, the kind of person who tells himself he deserves things and then quietly arranges the world to give them to him and calls it common sense. He had begun 2 years ago to manage Dorothy's finances as a favor. He had power of attorney, obtained through a process Dorothy's actual attorney A woman named Susan Park in the next county over had privately described as aggressively fast-tracked. He paid Dorothy's bills, handled her accounts, visited on Sundays with a casserole from the diner, and a running commentary on how much the house was worth in the current market and how a woman her age really shouldn't have to worry about all this upkeep. Dorothy thanked him for the casserole every week. She had also, for 2 years, been documenting every visit. Third person, Sheriff Bill Grady, 58, 23 years on the job. The kind of law enforcement presence that a small town builds its sense of safety around. Coached youth baseball. Had his photo on the wall of the diner. Said morning to everyone he passed by name because he'd known most of them since they were kids. Bill Grady was also, it would emerge, running a very quiet side arrangement with 3 local businesses, arrangements that involved looking the other way on certain inspections, certain complaints, certain incidents involving certain employees in exchange for envelopes that were left in the passenger side door of his personal truck, which he always parked in the same spot behind the hardware store on the second Friday of every month. Dorothy's house on Sycamore Lane had a clear sightline to that parking spot. She had a very good zoom lens. Now, let me tell you how this started. Because it didn't start as a plan. It started with a bird feeder. 4 years and 6 months ago, Dorothy's neighbor, a young woman named Patrice, installed a bird feeder in her backyard. Dorothy had been delighted. She loved birds. George had always teased her about it. She started spending more time at the back window, watching. She bought a pair of binoculars, then a camera, because she wanted to photograph the birds for a scrapbook. She was not good with technology. She asked Patrice's teenage son, a boy named Marcus, to help her set it up. Marcus, good kid, patient, the kind of teenager who actually looked at elderly people when they spoke, spent an afternoon teaching her the basics: how to zoom, how to record, how to save, and 10, how to, eventually, upload to a private folder online. He showed her the cloud storage as a way to back up her bird photos. Dorothy thought that was very sensible. The birds were wonderful. Everything else she started capturing was, in a different way, also wonderful. It started small. The first non-bird thing she recorded, entirely by accident, was Craig's Sunday visit. She'd left the camera running on the kitchen counter and forgotten it. When she reviewed the footage that evening, she watched herself offer Craig tea, watched Craig decline, watched Craig spend 45 minutes talking about the house, while slowly, almost casually, going through her desk drawer in the corner of the kitchen while her back was turned. Dorothy watched this footage 3 times. Then she saved it to the cloud folder. Then she moved the camera to a better angle. She did not confront Craig. She did not call the police. She had a suspicion, not yet confirmed, that calling the local police might not be as useful as it sounded. She did not know yet what she was building. She just kept recording. The second thing she caught was almost funny, except it wasn't. The owner of the Grover Falls Savings and Loan, a man named Philip Dodd, who had given the eulogy at George's funeral and cried what looked like genuine tears, was conducting meetings in his car, parked 3 houses down from Dorothy's, because he apparently believed that an empty residential street at 9 in the morning was private. It was not private. Dorothy was at her front window with her bird camera. Philip Dodd was meeting with a woman who was not his wife. That, in itself, was between Philip and God, and eventually his wife. What made it relevant to the wider community was the briefcase that changed hands during the 3rd meeting, the documents inside it. The conversation Dorothy's Zoom microphone captured about rezoning applications, council votes, and a development deal that was going to make Philip and 2 other men a great deal of money, while a piece of community green space that had been used as a park for 30 years got quietly converted to a parking structure. Dorothy had taken her grandchildren to that park. She didn't have grandchildren, but she had taken other people's grandchildren there. That park had a swing set that every child in Grover Falls had been pushed on at some point. She saved the footage. She kept going. Over the next 4 years, the camera, or rather cameras, because she eventually had 4 of them positioned at different windows, captured the following, in no particular order. The high school vice principal, a man named Dennis Walsh, buying exam answers from a parent who worked at a printing company and selling them to students for $200 each. Dorothy had tutored students at that school for 6 years. She knew which kids were struggling honestly and which ones weren't. Craig, on a Sunday visit, pocketing 3 pieces of George's antique silverware while pretending to help Dorothy organize the dining room. Then, 2 weeks later, pretending to notice the silverware was missing and suggesting, gently, that Dorothy might have put it somewhere she'd forgotten. "Poor thing," he'd said, shaking his head. Dorothy had been looking directly at the camera when he said it. Her expression was completely neutral. Sheriff Grady and his second Friday envelopes. 7 occasions over 14 months. A member of the town council, a woman named Brenda Foster, chairperson of the Community Ethics Committee, organizer of the annual Integrity Pledge, the woman who ran the Character Counts Assembly at the elementary school every September, conducting what could only be described as a sustained campaign of quiet harassment against the owner of a competing business, including what appeared to be a recorded conversation directing someone to file false complaints with the county health inspector. And this is the one that broke Dorothy's heart a little, because she had genuinely liked Brenda, the pastor of the Grover Falls Community Church, a man named Reverend Allen Price, who collected money every December for the town's winter shelter fund. Dorothy had donated to that fund for 11 years. $740 in total, she had calculated once, because Dorothy was the kind of woman who kept that kind of record. Reverend Price directed the shelter fund money to an account that was not the shelter. Dorothy had the transfer receipts, she'd found them, neatly printed, when Allen had stopped by to fix a loose step on her porch and accidentally left his folder on the kitchen table, and she'd photographed every page while he was outside. She made herself a cup of tea after that one, sat in George's chair, looked at his photograph on the mantel. "Georgie," she said to the photograph, "I think I'm going to need a bigger cloud folder." Here is what nobody understood about Dorothy Hale. Yes, she sometimes got names wrong. Yes, she occasionally repeated a story. Yes, there was the incident at the pharmacy with the pin which happened. She had explained to exactly no one, because she'd recently changed accounts after noticing an unauthorized transfer on her statement, something Craig had explained away as an administrative correction, and she had noted and photographed the bank statement before he could. What she had was not confusion. What she had was age, which is different. Age meant some things moved slower, her joints, her reaction time, the retrieval of certain proper nouns. It did not mean her mind was failing. Her mind was, in fact, doing some of the most precise and deliberate work it had ever done. She spent the last 18 months of her life organizing. She had her attorney, Susan Park, who drove up from the next county and met Dorothy at a coffee shop, not at Dorothy's house, because Dorothy had decided that her house was, for the time being, best kept as her own private operation, organize a legal framework around the footage. Susan Park was a woman who had spent 30 years being underestimated by opposing counsel and had built an exceptional career out of the gap between what people expected and what she actually delivered. She and Dorothy got along immediately. They set up the upload schedule, a series of files organized by subject: 1 on the rezoning corruption, 1 on the shelter fund, 1 on Craig's visits, 1 on Sheriff Grady, 1 on Dennis Walsh, and so on, with metadata, timestamps, and in several cases, supporting documentation attached. They also set up the distribution list. Not just YouTube, not just social media, the files would go simultaneously to the county prosecutor's office, the state attorney general's office, the local newspaper, 2 regional TV stations, and a journalist named Rachel Torres at a paper 3 counties over who had been trying to investigate Grover Falls city corruption for 2 years and kept hitting walls. The upload was set to trigger automatically, timed to Dorothy's death, or rather, to 72 hours after her attorney received confirmation of it, giving Susan Park time to ensure everything was in order. "What if you don't die for another 20 years?" Susan had asked. with the particular matter-of-factness of a woman who has learned to have these conversations plainly. Then I'll update the schedule. Dorothy had said, I'm not planning on going anywhere particularly soon, but when I do go, I'd like to go having taken care of a few things first. She had also written a note, not for the authorities, not for the press, for the town. One page, handwritten, scanned, and attached to the upload. It began, To whoever is reading this, I wasn't confused. I was watching. There's a difference. I hope you learn it. If you're still watching at this point, and you haven't subscribed yet, we see you. No pressure. Just know, the next story might be the one you tell your friends about, and you'd hate to miss it. Subscribe. Takes 2 seconds. Dorothy Hale died on a Monday night in October. She died in George's chair. The television was on. She'd been watching a nature documentary about migratory birds, which Susan Park later said was exactly right. The paramedics noted she looked peaceful. Her neighbor, Patrice, who had called them, told them she'd knocked and gotten no answer and had a feeling. The town was sad, in the vague way towns are sad about old women who've been around forever. There was a note in the weekly circular. The diner put a small card in the window. Craig Hale was at Susan Park's office by Tuesday afternoon, asking about the will, about the house, about the timeline. Susan Park told him, pleasantly, that everything was in order and that she'd be in touch. She was in touch on Thursday morning, though not the way Craig had expected. The upload went live at 6 a.m. By 6:45, the journalist Rachel Torres was on the phone with her editor. By 7:30, the files had been downloaded by the county prosecutor's office. By 8, someone had shared a clip of the rezoning footage on social media, and it had been viewed 11,000 times. By 9, Grover Falls was a different town than it had been the night before. The mayor called Sheriff Grady. Grady didn't pick up. He was watching the footage of himself at the hardware store parking lot and appeared, according to his deputy who was standing nearby, to have stopped breathing for several seconds. Philip Dodd called his attorney, then his wife, in that order, which told you everything about Philip Dodd. Dennis Walsh drove to the school board office and then apparently changed his mind and drove past it and kept going. Brenda Foster, chair of the Community Ethics Committee, released a statement through a hastily assembled PR contact, saying she was shocked and saddened by these alleged misrepresentations and looked forward to full transparency. The statement was up for 42 minutes before someone posted the timestamp of her footage alongside it, and the ratio, as they say, was not favorable. Reverend Alan Price did not release a statement. He did not appear at the church that Thursday. The church secretary, a woman who had worked there for 16 years and had suspected for at least 4 that something was wrong with the shelter fund accounting, opened the building, sat at her desk, and cried for a while, not because she was sad, but because she was, after years of telling herself she must be wrong, relieved. Craig Hale drove to Dorothy's house. He sat outside in his oversized truck for 20 minutes. Then he drove away. Then he came back. Then he drove away again. He was arrested at his dealership at 11:15 that morning on preliminary charges related to financial elder abuse. The arresting officer noted that Craig said very little. He just kept shaking his head with the expression of a man who cannot quite believe that the person who outmaneuvered him was his 81-year-old aunt. Rachel Torres's first article went up at noon. The headline was simple. She saw everything. It was the most read article in the paper's 47-year history by 6 o'clock that evening. Grover Falls spent the next several weeks finding out what it actually was. This is always the hard part. Not the exposures themselves, those are shocking. But shock is manageable. Shock has a known shape. The hard part is the after. The looking around at your neighbors and your institutions and your systems and recalibrating. Sheriff Grady resigned on Friday, ahead of an investigation that everyone understood was going to recommend criminal charges. He gave a brief statement outside his office. He did not use the word sorry. He used the word regrettable, which told you something. His deputy, a 32-year-old woman named Karen Mills, who had joined the department 3 years ago and had already quietly filed 2 internal complaints that had gone nowhere, was appointed interim sheriff. She accepted with the composure of a woman who has been ready for longer than anyone realized. The rezoning deal collapsed. The community green space remained a park. The swing set stayed. The state opened a formal investigation into the shelter fund. Reverend Price was charged. The money, not all of it, but most of it, was recovered and redistributed. The winter shelter received a donation from an anonymous source that turned out, eventually, to be Susan Park making a gesture on behalf of Dorothy's estate. Dennis Walsh resigned from the school board. 3 families whose children had purchased exam answers came forward voluntarily. The students involved faced academic review that was handled with more nuance than the adults might have deserved, because most of them were 17 and had been failed by someone in a position of authority. Philip Dodd's bank went under independent audit. The parking structure never got built. His wife, a woman named Carol who had suspected something for years and had been told by more than one person that she was imagining things, filed for divorce. And Craig Hale spent 8 months in a legal process that ended with a plea agreement, financial restitution, and a criminal record that attached itself to his name with the permanence of fact. The house on Sycamore Lane, which was not Craig's, had never been Craig's, and had been left in Dorothy's will to a local charity that provided housing for elderly residents who needed support, was transferred exactly as Dorothy had intended. Dorothy's note, the handwritten one, was reprinted in 3 papers and shared more than 100,000 times online. I wasn't confused. I was watching. There's a difference. I hope you learn it. People had it printed on mugs and framed prints and posted it in their offices and on their refrigerators, which was perhaps not what Dorothy had intended. But then again, Dorothy had been a practical woman. She might have appreciated the reach. Patrice, the neighbor with the bird feeder, gave a television interview in which she said, "I knew Dorothy wasn't confused. I just didn't know she was busy." She laughed when she said it. The interviewer laughed too. It was the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere genuine, the release of a tension that had been held too long. Marcus, the teenager who had set up the camera and taught Dorothy how to upload to the cloud, who was now 20 and in college, studying communications, which felt appropriate, found out about his role in it all via a text message from his mother, and reportedly sat in his dorm room for a full hour, not moving. He later said, "She asked me to show her how to upload bird photos. I showed her. I thought that was what she meant." He seemed delighted to have been wrong. There's a thing that happens when a community gets caught, really caught, undeniably caught. With documentation and timestamps and 14 hours of footage, it has a choice about what to do with that information. Some communities choose defensiveness, choose to protect the institution over the truth, close ranks, weather it, call it an attack from outside. Grover Falls, to its partial credit, didn't do that. Maybe it was because Dorothy Hale was one of their own. Maybe it was because the footage was so clear, so organized, so completely impossible to reframe. Maybe it was because Rachel Torres's reporting was so thorough that there was simply no version available that wasn't the truth. Or maybe it was the note. I wasn't confused. I was watching. Something about those words. Because here's what they actually meant. Underneath the obvious meaning, what they meant was, I was here. I paid attention. I gave enough of a damn about this place to spend 4 years recording everything that was wrong with it, not out of malice, out of care, out of the stubborn, enduring, completely underestimated love of an old woman for a town that had stopped seeing her. That's what broke people. Not the corruption. Corruption was awful, but familiar. What broke people was realizing that the woman they'd written off, the woman they'd patted on the shoulder and spoken to slowly, and discussed in the third person at her own dinner table, that woman had been more invested in the health of their community than everyone she'd recorded. Combined, they put a bench in the park on Sycamore Lane, the park where the swing set was, the one they'd almost lost. Small bronze plaque, her name, and underneath it, the last line of her note. She saw everything. She still loved this place enough to fix it. People sit on that bench. They push their kids on the swing set. Grover Falls is still a town with problems because all towns are towns with problems. But when people ask about Dorothy Hale, the answer has changed. She's not poor old Dorothy anymore. She's just Dorothy. And the way people say it now, it sounds like exactly what it is. A name that means something. Here's the thing I keep coming back to. Dorothy didn't do this out of anger. She never confronted anyone, never made a scene, never once let on that she was watching not to Craig when he pocketed the silverware, not to Grady when she zoomed in on his parking spot, not to any of them. She just kept recording, kept saving, kept trusting that eventually the truth handled correctly is its own justice. She didn't live to see it, but she made absolutely certain it happened anyway. And here is the question I want to leave with you. Dorothy had 4 years of footage. She had power of attorney abuse happening in her own kitchen. She could have gone to the authorities much earlier, taken what she had, and handed it over. But she waited. She built the complete picture first. Was she right to wait? Or should she have spoken up sooner, even if it meant a less complete case? Tell me in the comments. I want the real answer, not the easy one. And if Dorothy's story moved, you share it. Someone in your life needs to hear that quiet doesn't mean weak. And while you're here, if you're not subscribed yet, do it now. You've been here 20 minutes. You clearly belong here. Stay sharp, stay watching, and never underestimate the person in the corner who isn't saying much.